Welcome everyone. Today we are joined by a very brave whistleblower, Elizabeth. So welcome, Elizabeth.
Hi.
So nice to have you. It's a really important conversation that I've been looking forward to having today, because Elizabeth experienced being targeted and a lot of what we would call, I guess, black technology, electronic harassment, as well as physical abuse while she was on a posting overseas in her early 20s. And we know that so much of this targeting is very common with whistleblowers and survivors. And I know that I've experienced it for 2 years as I was breaking my partner away from his cult family. And it's until you've actually, I guess, lived through it and, recognize the means that these people have of, not just black magic in a cult, but it's also very much entwined with electronic warfare and energy warfare as well. And hearing and knowing Elizabeth's story, her experience of this black tech is really next level, because she was so involved with government programs. She was on a diplomatic posting overseas and really, I guess, almost in the testing grounds of all of this as well. And so I just wanted to go through just a bit of a definition of what this black tech is, because I know it's a bit of a different concept for a lot of people that haven't necessarily experienced it. So Elisa E, who is an incredible survivor of MK Ultra, and basically being set up as programmed as an assassin, has written about this black tech, saying that access to MK Ultra cutting edge technology for no-touch torture and slavery has now expanded beyond its original federal military and intelligence agency gatekeepers to defence contractors like Lockheed and Martin and Raytheon, to other transnational corporations like the police, criminal cabals, cults, churches, NATO, satanic corporate Illuminati families. And now MK Ultra is really coming of age under the transhumanist phase of nanotechnology and brain-computer interface, which is completely run entirely by artificial intelligence. So it gives you a bit of a scope of, this is really talking about non-touch torture methods, where, targeted individuals can be, meshed into electronic interfaces, receive various forms of harassment. There's things like voice to skull technology and just overall frequency and this kind of hive mind of, actually being able to plug people into, I guess, programs to really affect their emotional state and what they're able to do in terms of their own healing and moving forward in their lives. And, it's so important that these conversations, I think, about, exactly what technology is being used against whistleblowers and survivors come to the forefront, because, these are really powerful institutions like the military, our defense, our governments, and all of this information about, these weapons that they're using is not made public. And so, whistleblowers coming forward are often, disbelieved. There's no one for them to go to. There's not, necessarily a lot of healing understanding either. And I know Elizabeth's story is incredible, because she was able to actually deprogram herself very much to a large degree, and by following her intuition, really be guided through that whole process of, coming back to spirit and coming back to herself and healing after this onslaught of technology. And despite Elizabeth, following up when she got back to Australia on, I guess, receiving justice for these crimes that were perpetuated against her, nothing's happened. And this is the saddest thing, is all of these things get put under national security. Just as, whistleblowers coming forward, informing on government programs or MK Ultra, as survivors of ritual abuse coming forward, they're often targeted and placed under this national security banner. And really, the only thing that's keeping secure is these criminal corporations and cults running these programs over people. And I wanted to read just a short excerpt from Elizabeth's open letter to ASIO that she sent through. And I think this really frames, just her experience and what she saw before we start going into her story. So Elizabeth wrote that there is obviously a worldwide elite group involved in some of the Black projects, of which some members are in positions of power in government and spy agencies. This explains to me why so much advanced technology is given to very ordinary people who just happen to be employed in a protective service, and why there are no consequences for its abuse, even though legislation supposedly prohibits it. Even on my posting, Marines were given exotic technology to control people, which they used recreationally. No doubt, like all of the people in my social sphere back then and now, they at some point would have been targeted with this to keep them compliant and are not too knowledgeable about a much more sinister agenda if they didn't blindly follow the orders. I can only assume that this is why the Marines that observed me daily allowed me to be abused, exploited, and degraded in a way that went on for over 8 months. Wow. So yeah, what a it just strikes me, Elizabeth, you know, you're such a young woman, you were, you know, on this overseas posting that would kind of be, you know, thinking working as a diplomat would be a bit of a job of a lifetime, like getting to travel and work overseas and experience things. And it certainly wasn't that in the end at all for you, was it?
No, I actually thought, you know, because I came from a fairly ordinary family, like a lot of people back then. It wasn't an academic family, it's quite dysfunctional, that the people would be really sophisticated. I knew that I was, you know, I really thought I could learn from the people that I worked with, and it was a hard department to get into. You know, I think I had 3 interviews and a lot of extensive vetting. So yeah, I remember, you know, it took 8 months because I also had to wait for a replacement. So I put in that I'd resigned, and I even had to wait amidst being harassed until I got a replacement. And by then, everyone in the embassy was told not to talk to me. It was a small embassy anyway. So the 2 women that could have helped didn't. But to be honest, Gabbi, the longer the harassment went on, and the more I got sort of amnesiaed because of this neural block that was, I just call it a memory block, the more people just thought that was the status quo, and that because it kept happening, people then seemed to come to get into this mindset that it was my fault. Because why would that happen? Why would I keep being targeted? Plus, on top of that, I had a bogus profile made about me by the US agents that my main Marine perpetrator was working with. So that how it actually started was, I mean, it's complex to explain because it's levels within levels, where all these spooks are compartmentalized anyway. But I'd already, when I first got there, been fiddled with, and by that I mean there was a spy house next door to the house I was given. And I can remember waking up sometimes and talking to these men in dark suits and being very scared by that. But then I'd go back to sleep, and then the next day I'd wake up and I'd be in my bed. So sometimes I remember sitting and chatting with them, and they'd always have a Marine in tow as well. So again, they were privy to what these fellas were using. And I think by then I'd been encoded not to see what they were using, because I'd see their hands working and I couldn't actually see what they were using.
Oh, wow. Wow. And this is going back to
This is 1989. Yeah.
in Mexico, where Elizabeth
Yeah.
was posted.
Yeah.
And you just mentioned the idea of a memory blocks. I just wanted to give viewers a bit of background on that, because that's a bit of a different term as well. So there was a movie, and this is Robert Duncan, who was a whistleblower and worked previously to develop a lot of tech for NATO, the military, and defence contractors, has written a number of books, including The Matrix Deciphered. And he actually goes through what a memory block is and how he's seen that, how he's had informants describe that. And so he describes it that it was mentioned in the movie Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is a reference to Aldous Huxley's work. And it's about where people in that movie could remove selective memories of old lovers if they were too painful. Now, there's actually a CIA program called EDOM, so Electronic Dissolution of Memories, which is about this exact technology. And the way that it works, or the way that it's set up, is this EDOM uses hypnosis, and a signal coherence to actually change and erase memories in the brain. And it's combined with severe trauma and psychological abuse. These methods are used to try and get a victim to both repress and forget their experiences from, unethical experimentation of electronic mind mapping, influence, and control, because it's not really out there to be discovered yet. So this is something that's been written about, that people on the inside are coming forward and letting us know. So just in case that memory block is new to anyone, but how scary to be on this posting overseas. And like, how did it first come to your attention, I guess, that
Well, when I knew I was initially being sort of interviewed with, there was a political secretary there. It was a very small embassy, really only 4 staff. And I remember saying to him, look, I'm waking up next door and this makes me nervous. And anyway, I don't know if this was programming himself. I think he was very focused on his work, and he was quite new to the role, but he just pretty much dismissed me. And nothing ever came of when I spoke to this man. And so I just, anyway, after a while, they sort of stopped, or if they continued with me, I don't remember it. So that happened in the first couple of months. Then one night I remember I used to walk to and from the shops. There were 2 men in dark suits talking about what I think was a military operation. I was trying to get into my house, but by then my block was being fiddled with, because this Marine that ended up being the main perpetrator had arrived. Anyway, I think being so paranoid, they thought I was standing there wanting to listen to their secret information. Whereas quite frankly, if it was that secret, go inside and talk about your, But I wasn't. I was simply trying to get my door open. And I remember they looked at me that way spooks do. And the next day when I got home, because I used to get dropped off by drivers, I used to like going for a walk. A little bit later, I went for a walk, and the same 2 were there. And one made a point of bumping into me deliberately. Now, he was a big fella, and he nearly knocked me sideways. And so I wonder if that was the start of this neural block via nanotechnology, because that electronic memory dissolution you speak of, I've read about that too, is different to what I experienced in terms of my memories were fresh. It was like I extracted them from a filing cabinet.
Wow.
And it's also different from the chip that a friend of mine explained that her ex-husband had, who was in Black Ops. Although I did have a chip put into me later on as the saga unfolds, and which was then removed in 2009. That was when that first started. So there's all these different levels to my targeting that sort of tallies up, I guess, with compartmentalisation, but also very reflective of the very misogynistic culture and the absolute inability of these people to understand trauma, even if they did care, human nature, what it was like to be so young, and that there was actually espionage against me, an Aussie, by Americans that ASIO never followed up with, and in fact, they ended up participating in. But so that was the beginning. Then I had found a puppy on the street who I named Henry, and that I'd restored to health. And then I decided I didn't really have a big enough yard for him, and I'd never really had a dog before. So I put a notice up, and this Marine came over who just arrived, and his name was Choong, not big fella, and he said, I'd like to take on that dog. And that's where I think he was a plant, because he would then come over and say, I'm just here to tell you how Henry's going, but he'd never bring Henry. And then there was a party for embassy people, and sometimes the Marines would socialise too. So we decided to go together. And the only reason I agreed to that was that because he'd taken the dog, I thought anyone who likes animals must be kind. But then when we got back after that party, he sort of forced his way in, and then wouldn't leave. And so this is hard to talk about, because I didn't really know what to do. Now, prior to that, I'd only had one fellow I'd actually ever been intimate with on that posting. So this Marine Choong was about 6 months into it, I guess. And we'd stayed friends. And so like any woman in that situation at that age with no experience in, how to deal with men like that, we ended up having intimacy that night. And that was purely because I didn't know how to send him home. and he didn't want to go home.
And this is
he
a big,
maintained that
muscular Marine
built
man,
like a
and
Mack truck, you know. I would have
it's
weighed 45
intimidating.
kilos at the time. You know, I'm not the biggest person, you know, I'm quite small. I was quite petite, particularly back then. But so I think he was set up to be my handler or controller, you know, maybe in between. And from then on, that was it. He just thought he had the entitlement to come and see me and come to my house every day.
Wow.
But I do think he was interfered with in that he seemed very, very keen to show off to men. I don't think he was particularly popular. And so a lot of that, he was such a strange person. A lot of that being with me was so that I think he could show off to other men. But like I said, you know, in my letter, to use me down the track as prey, because that first night of intimacy had happened. He was fairly concrete in his thinking anyway. So I think he just decided that I was just some, you know, easy woman, bit of a whore who'd just go with anyone. And because he never ever got to know me, he never asked me questions about my family. Sometimes he'd harass me into trying to get information about people at work, or I never talked to him about work. So in terms of there being a breach in national security, I never, ever talked about work. And actually, the more I got sort of his measure about this is not a nice person and he's making my life very difficult, the more I made a point of not looking at cables that came in or anything like that, so that he could not get anything out of me. That he seemed to want to use me to get a lot of attention. To, you know, that was always my impression. You know, it was a very macho environment. Well, what is machismo? It's that self-consciousness about being male. And but he did get quite obsessed, because the more I could sort of get him away from me, the more intense he became. And I don't think that fellow ever slept. You know, he would be spying on me in the spy house next door, and he'd be making phone calls, and I had 2 keys, he stole a key. He must have obviously got a key made, because even when I got that key back, he could get into my house. And he'd set up some sort of surveillance system. So, and because he had this key, it was so dreadful, because I'd get home from work and sometimes there'd be soldiers there and I would have no idea how they got in there.
How
but when the
actual young woman.
Yeah. And it was really difficult, particularly at that age, to talk about that to men, particularly very misogynistic men. So they just assumed from there on that Choong was my boyfriend. And so sometimes I didn't say anything, because I just thought, you know what, he will lose interest. Because sometimes what would happen is I'd get dropped off, and then I'd cross the road to where some Marines, where they had this big sort of seating rock, and I'd sit on that. That was sort of their display with their plaque on it. I'd just sit on that, and he'd stand at my door waiting to get in, to push his way in, and I would just wait it out. And so sometimes he couldn't get in. And I used to just think, you know, like any bully, if he's got to get bored with this. He will just get bored, but he never did. In fact, it just seemed to ratchet up his intensity towards harassing me. And but that was the awful thing, you know, never knowing he'd be there. But then on top of that, I had this neural block or memory block. Now, when that happened was after a first group sexual assault. So after sort of a month or two of this fellow, you know, establishing himself as the alpha male in terms of bullying me, and prior to that, he kept trying to set up things with men. And I remember sitting on my balcony and one calling over and saying, "Oh, are you coming over tonight?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, Sean told us you were coming over," meaning, you know, for some sort of sexual thing. And he said, "Oh, look, I'll tell the others, that's fine. I didn't think you were that type," you know. So some of these guys knew that I was just an ordinary person. Like, had I been left alone by that Marine, I could have easily been just mates with them. And so it's easy to go, "Oh, they should have known better." But some of them, this Marine was such a liar. And I really think sometimes he believed a lot of his own lies about me. And so he tried that a couple of times. And I remember one night he'd actually let Marines in and I completely unraveled. I'm pretty sure he drugged me on that night. And nothing happened, because I thought, you know, like, So that's when, just out of a sense of levity, I think I mentioned something about ASIO interviewing me initially, how they'd wanted more action on the spine front, because I found that really funny back in the day. Again, if you go back to people's basic maturity, you know, here's this grown man telling me that, you know, he was so disappointed that there wasn't more happening, and all they got was fairly administrative stuff. Now, I never would have normally even repeated that, but when you're under stress, you know, I didn't want these guys peeling my clothes off. I just said that. So naturally, you know, this Marine Choong kept that, you know, he was always trying to sort of get stuff out of me that he then told on me for.
Yes.
But really, you know, it wasn't groundbreaking stuff anyway. I hadn't, but these Americans wanted to turn it into something because they wanted to target me anyway. So there was a lot of making a big deal out of nothing. And because there were different levels, I think some of them were bored. I don't think a lot of them had enough to do a lot of the time. So any excuse to really, you know, get into targeting someone or looking for stuff that wasn't there. But anyway, after those first few attempts, after that, it did happen where he had this little offsider who took me to the house next door and placed me on top of this Marine. And, you know, they're all cheering. You know, I remember crying. But I remember also going into this deep shock, you know, this deep shock. And it's interesting, anyone with PTSD, so it's already an automatic type of traumatic response, it's easy to give in because you've got nothing, there's nothing to hang on to mentally. And I'm quite sure a lot of survivors out there would appreciate that feeling. You just have nothing to hang on to. And that was a pattern that I would leap into every time I was targeted after that posting. But anyway, so after that happened, I went home and, you know, went through all the processes you do when you feel grotty, and just sort of showered a lot. And the next day I remember feeling so turned up, you know, about it, but so humiliated, so embarrassed, thinking I've got to tell Colin or someone. But I had no woman to really talk to because...
Was that your boss that you were planning on reporting it to?
Well, political secretary, yeah. I mean, they were all my seniors, you know, I was just this little junior admin person.
How terrifying that it's now not just this Marine, but he's handling you as such. And, you know.
And not only that, that some of them had a hive connection to me. Some of them were nearly integrated with me, which I'll get to later on. Although it was a base where they seemed to come and go. But yeah, so anyway, after that first day, I remember thinking, I can't tell him. I just, you know, and when you shut down with trauma too, it becomes hard to articulate. You get into this very primal survival mode. So I went home that night and I remember thinking, I'll tell him tomorrow, you know, but God, I wish I could forget this. Well, next morning, I wake up and I remember thinking, this is odd, there's something I need to talk to Colin about, and I can't remember what it is. And yet I was getting visual cues from people. So that is when that neural block happened. That's when the resetting started happening on top of an existing layer of amnesia that from the first couple of spooks in the dark streets where I was waking and being put back to sleep in the bookstore, which I had complained about, which Colin had not actioned. Colin was a political secretary. That's Colin Adams. I don't mind saying his name. He should be in jail. He's now the head of Cardno International and doing just dandy, you know. So that was the second neural block. But in the meantime, I'm going to work. I'm coming home. I'm doing my daily walk. And they must have taken photos because a couple of days later I could see Marines looking at photos. And just from the way they were looking at me, it was like, you know, they were of me. And that put me into shock again. And I remember thinking, well, I was sort of glad I didn't remember because who would want to know that? But unbeknownst to me, this Marine Choong had set up a neural feedback, like it's some sort of feedback system where they could watch him anyway. And like watch intimacy, you know, even using that word intimacy because it wasn't that. So he'd done that already. So, you know, that was one element of exotic tech that they had already back in the day.
And this is 1989, isn't it? Just
yeah, 1980. That's 1989. Yeah, and then a reception was coming up, and so in between that, I'm driving, you know, getting home. I'm sitting outside trying not to let this Marine come in. Although by the time he got my key, he must have made a copy. It didn't seem to matter because, as I said, it got to a point where I never knew whether he'd be in there or not. And until they got the first lock change, so I had 2 lock changes to my door, then he couldn't. So that was when I could start defending myself. But it was so hard because with that neural block, as an adjunct to that, there were other spooks in the spy house who I could see because they had a window, and I had my kitchen. They had a laptop before there were laptops, and around about that time, you know, and even before then, my mood was being altered. So that was the psychotronic element to that, because I've always been a fairly easy person. Takes a lot to rile me. I've never been a moody sort of person. And all of a sudden, I'm feeling these moods that were just so different to me, fundamentally me. And then they got to a point where they could turn me up, turn me down, phase me in, phase me out. And by phase me out, I mean like electronic possession, where I would go somewhere I have no idea where, and they could actually take over. So that was pretty scary and gave me PTSD.
Your body would still be functioning, but you literally weren't mentally there anymore.
I literally was not there. Yep. So anyway, so there was more of that happening, where that's how I know there was the interfacing there. Then there was a reception, and that Marine and his same offsider drugged me because they came along to that reception. And I had this sort of like a fainting spell there. And again, people were so unobservant. It's astonishing. At least people are more switched on now about noting behaviour unacceptable. But and I remember Keith Baker, the ambassador, said, "Oh, well, you can go now." So I went, and I woke up the next morning, and I was very groggy. So I got to work and I could not stay awake. So obviously, whatever they'd given me took a long time to metabolize through my body. And I've since found out from a doctor I do lack some enzymes for certain drugs. So it's astonishing, really, they didn't OD me. So drugging was a big part of his harassment as well too. You know, I was a creature of habit. I'd always have a cup of tea after work. He'd put something in the tea because he'd always be there if he could get in. Second lock change was harder, but after a while he managed to do the same thing. But again, all this speak community, you know, never once intervening to stop this guy. He was just given carte blanche on doing whatever he wanted. But anyway, after that drugging incident that was known at the embassy reception.
So you reported the drugging at
well,
work?
Keith and Colin were there, like everybody was there. And
of course they saw you.
They realised that I must have been drugged, because even though I'd gone to work, like again, I'm a very disciplined person, I could not stay awake. So, and then someone must have said something, one of the soldiers, because there were a few Marines there, where they found out I'd been drugged. And Keith came in, I remember, and saying, "Oh, look, I'm sorry about this." But this was before the first group sexual assault had come to light, which it did. So he sent in the American ambassador, who said, "Oh my gosh, you know, sorry." And so then the American ambassador, let's hold a reception to say sorry. Like, how weird is that, right?
A party.
And even though by then I knew something was wrong, like I was resetting and mentioning that something was wrong, because I said, there's something wrong, you know. You're left with remnants of feelings. I had said I didn't want to go to any reception, and I remember Keith Baker repeatedly bullied me into going to that because he just wanted to impress the American ambassador. In the meantime, my perpetrator has gone into my house. He's taken out a lot of music that I bought there and recorded songs to use as the background music, you know, because everyone's just assuming he's my boyfriend, even though I'm saying this man is not my boyfriend. He's a monster, you know. Like even with the memory block, I knew he was a bully, and very, you know, he wasn't abusive.
Absolute predator.
He was also physically abusive, you know. So one day when I wandered down the street and I saw him waiting there, which he always did, I actually lost my temper and said, "Look, will you just fuck off?" Yeah. Well, he slapped me to the ground and he grabbed my hair and he dragged me in with his key. That was my key. All these Marines are watching, you know, looking on, and not one of them intervened. So
not one decent human being could see a young woman under distress and do something, you know. And these are meant to be people that are allegedly protecting the country. Very disappointing. Yeah.
And then from there, of course, because he had this key and he'd become the handler, he also became the king. I know there were a lot of incidences where soldiers were coming in, or I was being taken next door, and I was servicing them. But a lot of that, even without the memory block, I just disassociated from. What's interesting is that sometimes I'd see a pink light. I'd fuzz out or phase out with a pink light. And I know Alyssa mentions that in her book, and I thought, isn't that interesting? Because I used to see a pink light.
Mm.
And so there's some of that that I will never be able to recall. And that's fine, because, you know, I've still pretty much got an idea. Because after that, there was another group sexual assault that happened. And it was very much, you know, take two of the same sort of thing, with this Marine. And but again, resetting and resetting and resetting. But then by the time the second sexual assault happened, Marines must have talked, or they must have got a hold of the photos or something. But even the Marine captain was ignoring me. Like, I was saying, can you just get this away from me? Like, he's not my boyfriend. And I tried to talk to him, and I said, look, you're actually really affecting my mental health. Well, I think he was, but I think all the electronic fiddling was also having its effect on me, because, again, I'd been a meditator since I was 17. I had a very calm, inner, still mind. I never had a lot of mind chatter, or I was just a very calm, quiet person. But all of a sudden, and I'll never forget this one night, because this Marine would come over every day, every day, every day. Now, I'm sure part of the torture program was that he would never talk. Sometimes he'd block me from going to places, and he could get fisticuffy, and I just think it was all part of it. But anyway, this one night when I tried to talk to him about it, because I thought, you know, you started off with a family, like, why have you changed all of a sudden just because you're in this group of men? I think what happened with him was, I do think he was bisexual, or more along the homosexual lines. I really do. And I think maybe he didn't realise that till he got there. And that was confusion, because he was a very, very confused man. And it's not as though, as I said, he was attracted to me, but it was all about the power.
It's
And this
control,
is why
wasn't it?
we've got
Control
to,
and bullying.
yep, bullying. While we've really got to get a handle on coercive control, and, you know, where you're getting into sort of targeting and trauma, where it's all about the bullying. And it's not about whether they find you attractive. I can guarantee you he did not find me attractive, but it was someone he could use. And so I had to be the reward. But at the same time, he wanted to be the one in control of how I was to be used. So,
And yeah, and he was basically, you know, the one instigating these group, you know, sexual
always,
scenarios.
yep. And but it's interesting,
So awful.
because they obviously, at the end of, I got intel from someone who was high up in IT contracting, who worked with defence, who's actually a mate of my husband's, who had other friends in high places, and they all did some snooping. And he was discharged a year and a half after I left. So either he went to some military prison, or they let him still carry on until he disgraced himself again. But my impression was the Marine Corps as such didn't like him. But because intelligence, black intelligence, had taken over, he was allowed to just do whatever he wanted, until such a time as I left, because obviously they wanted to subjugate me and cover that up until I left. It all got to a point where no one was listening, you know. So
it's just so shocking that, like, there wasn't a single supervisor there or anyone with any authority to actually investigate what was going on. You know, even just any part of it, even you saying, like, this man isn't my boyfriend, he's breaking into my house, you know, as well as the sexual assault, as well as him handling you into other, you know, other horrific situations with other men. It's so just unfathomable that no one did any investigating. And, you know, it really is. It's like they were a bunch of little boys with these, you know, black tech toys just running amok, out of control.
And as I said, I can understand the juvenile response or their aggression, because I also had female agents who were behaving very, very immaturely. So in between that, I'll never forget, one night there was a female agent, and this perpetrator's offsider who'd taken me to the spy house next door for this first group assault, and he'd taken the photos. And they were sort of, because he was just saying a lot of really untrue stuff that was designed to humiliate me sexually. And also some of that was about how I was supposedly sexually. And so they were standing in front on the balcony, and she was saying, oh, she was sort of emulating that they were having sex, you know. Anyway, I was so shut down by then. I actually did think she was his girlfriend. But why have a female agent? Again, these women are not proper women. Why would you not support your own? Unlike her, I was fighting. It was like Lord of the Flies every day just to get into my house when I could actually have that security and not have my key taken. By then, spooks were coming into the embassy, so security was a joke. And the one time when I was cognizant enough, before I was really shut down by the trauma, I do remember trying to send a cable home. And I remember this spook saying, oh, has that come back? And so that somehow they blocked me sending it. I couldn't remember numbers. I couldn't remember even how to get to there. There was a mall area on top of the building I worked in. So much of my memory was shut down by then. But what I had done was I was writing down pieces of information like Choong is a perpetrator, do not let him in. There is ASIO. After a while, that paper disappeared. So that was all I had. But another thing I discovered was that because, you know, you're young, you're fluid, you know, you're living your life. I knew something was wrong. I knew I wasn't all of me. And just by using other people as cues. So what I started doing was singing the harassment I was getting, singing it, because I'd been a singer before and I knew that even people with Alzheimer's or dementia, there's a different area of the brain that can retain those memories. So just quite intuitively, I started singing. And I was, and I put some of that in a letter I sent Keith Baker, because I wrote to both fellows once I integrated. I even went round to his house. His wife wouldn't let me see him. These women, I don't know whether they choose not to know. But anyway, I set her straight about everything her husband had been complicit in. And even then, she minimalised it. So I don't know what it is about people of that generation where there's a cut-off point.
They're really enabling this to continue happening, aren't they, Elizabeth? Do you know what I mean? Like anyone that looks the other way when a young woman is being, you know, horrifically, physically and electronically, you know, abused is an enabler.
Yeah.
And how could you live in a relationship knowing that your husband was perpetrating that? It's probably quite likely that she's a victim of it as well, knowing the way these operations work.
Yeah. But they're very perverted people, because getting back to that female agent, there was another one who was quite pretty, and she had a boyfriend called John, who was one of the Marines, who on the hearsay of Choong started coming to my house for sex. And I remember saying to him, look, I have a memory block. You've got to help me. You know, this is not me. I am being made to do this. And on top of that, you know, with that amnesia, it was very hard for me to feel. You need your memories for emotional conviction. This is what people don't realise. That on top of the shock made me feel like a bit of an empty shell and surreal. And then on top of that, someone's being drugged anyway. But anyway, his girlfriend must have got wind of the fact that he was coming to my place. And instead of investigating him, I'll never forget this. One night she wandered past with him, because they're routine, and a lot of people just wandered around up and down the streets. And I had Choong, as per usual, at my gate, and I'm saying, will you get away? I don't want you in my house. And so I was yelling at him. And anyway, this was when the first episode of my own ability to render him helpless. Like I remember shouting at him and glaring, and then all of a sudden he went into this catatonic stage. But I had been so humiliated, so violated by then. I have my own theory, you know, for when we reach our own spiritual power. It's like black magic when these people want to coerce and control. They know that technology is being used on you. I know he was apprised of that. And they want to force you into something you don't want to do. So it's all part of that satanic overreach, but overlay of this whole system, you know, that as you say, is now expanded.
All tricks, isn't it? Smoke and mirrors. Yeah.
So anyway, this female agent, she gets a gun and she points it right at my face, not just at me from a distance. And she says, you leave him alone. And what have you done to him? So in the meantime, another group of spooks, like when I talk about in my letter all these different colour codings, well, there were men in black suits, but they were all military type suits. There were men in grey suits. There were men in brown suits, like beige suits, green suits, you name it. So, and the ones who I recognised later on in Australia, turned this sort of equipment towards me, and they focused it on my genital area, and energetically we call it the base chakra. But anyway, that was designed to intensify my libido. I remember, again, just intuitively, like I'm not an occultist or anything like that, but I remember mentally projecting a mirror there to deflect it. And then after that, this agent, and her name was Karen, saying, well, we've got to talk. And then saying, come on. So we all went up to my room, and then something happened between her, me, and him. I think she was trying to impress John, this Marine. At that time, I can honestly say I was phased out, because I remember saying, just pleading in my head, like, I am not like this, I'm not promiscuous, and I certainly do not like women. So something did happen there, because I can remember coming back into my body at the tail end of that. So, but I think unlike the MK Ultra people that have alters that disassociate, mine was electronically done.
Yeah.
And even now I can't recall it, and I have to say I'm very grateful I can't. So now I don't think she would have been the sort of person who would ordinarily have done that necessarily. But what struck me about this whole lot of intelligence people is the hypersexuality and the absolute perversion of these people. Why on earth would you put technology and direct it at someone to try and amplify libido? Sometimes they could try and amplify fear, and they bring that out at the stomach area, the solar plexus. It didn't work on me the last time because, they try and ask questions to make you be fearful either about your integrity or emotional honesty or whatever, and it didn't work on me. And but the fear did. And when I say that, that's going back then decades later, when they were harassing me and using the same technology on me, which is absolutely atrocious. It's an abomination. But then there were other times too when other speaks would come in. Sometimes they would also have their way or just watch. I know sometimes I was hypnotized to not see people. And again, Alyssa talks about the cloaking. So I could sense sex energy in the room, but I couldn't see anybody. Sometimes I'd wake up. So this Marine, Choong, was given hypnotic cues by the Black Ops spooks, where I'd wake up sort of mid, being in the act with somebody. And sometimes they'd have a system, some of these Marines, where one would get into bed and say, oh, I'm Sean, and there'd be this sort of like hazy outline. But to me, it was sort of like programming to make me think I was seeing the same person, even though I didn't even like this Marine. So they had sort of almost like a system there where they could come in and do what they wanted to do.
So this is more like they're masking themselves, they're anonymous.
Yeah.
Able to do
or
that.
Making me think. Yeah, or making me think that they're the same Marine. And interestingly, it is like a cult anyway, because they all get the short hair, they all wear the uniform, and sometimes they all do look very similar. So when you're traumatized and dumbed down by that trauma, it's not that hard to really make that error either.
Yeah, so many belief structures and the power structures within, the military and, the Marines, etc., are so satanic in nature. So like you said, it's not a huge jump. Those ideals are already very much embedded in the beliefs and what these people are working under day to day. But it's just shocking to hear that there's just this other level, under the surface as well.
Yeah, and really, really perverted. And I could tell back at that age, they are trying to make people doubt their own sexuality. Like, I have no problem with what orientation people are, but I'm heterosexual. I'm just very uncomplicated. But there was a second time where they used a woman. And again, I think a lot of this too, because we all have our own psychology, right? With this Marine, I think, as I said, he did have sexual ambiguity. I think he was more along the homosexual spectrum. But anything he'd like to sort of project onto me, like a lot of weak people do. So the second time, now by then I'd started having seizures because he'd been drugging me a lot. And God knows, I tried to tell the ASIO fellows, who I remember once examined my milk, but I said, I think I'm being drugged, I'm coming to work, I'm feeling, cloth-headed, and, you just know, right? And sometimes he used the rape drug on me, always in retaliation if I'd managed to fob him off. So one time he used the rape drug with his same little offsider, who did end up getting sent home. So why did he and not Sean? They peeled my buttocks and took photos. And so anything vile and gross they could do, they did. So that was my humiliation and my punishment for not wanting him, even though, you know, I was just an object to him anyway. But the second time, the second group assault, no, the third, sorry, involved a woman called Wendy. Now, she wasn't an agent, and I don't think she worked at the embassy, but she was there in one of the houses on the street. And I remember her calling out the window and she said, "There's a party going on and you're the main attraction." Oh. And then they wandered into my house using, you know, the key. I remember I started having a couple of seizures then, and the Marine captain was there, and I said, "You have a wife, like, what are you doing? You have a wife." He said, "Oh, but you've showed us everything." So to me, that says that there were probably other incidences of which I'm unaware, where maybe the programming was in full swing. So I guess that is an alter, but again, a synthetic one, because it would have had to have been enforced through the technology. So they took me to this house next door. Again, I remember actually fighting with her and saying, "What are you doing?" You know, like, you know, but she wanted to really impress the men. And I remember her offering herself to them, and they said, "No, just get on with it." And I remember that was the second time I said, "If you do this," I said, something will happen to me because I don't like women. But that's the second time, and I know this sounds a bit strange, where again I call that in my head, because sometimes I'd feel people in my head and I'd get neural impulses. And I remember saying, "Please, you know, I can't cope with this." Anyway, that's when I had a major seizure. I had an out-of-body near-death experience, but I'd had a massive seizure initially. I'm on this synthetic plane that intersects the astral plane, is how I see it. There's a man and a woman dressed as agents, and one of them said, "I'm taking her home because look at what they're doing to her and what they'll do to her for years to come." And then this real light tunnel sort of opened. So they'd obviously sort of taken me to a point where that seizure had caused sort of like near death. Yeah. But then I woke up in a military facility, and the same. It gets complicated to explain, because by then I had a chip put in, but the same fellow who had put in the chip was poking around in the back of my head and saying, "Have a look in there." So either they were trying to find something, or they were fiddling with whatever they'd put in, you know, initially. But I've always remembered that. So whatever that interface hive connection was, they did. It's a funny code of ethics. I've always been grateful that I can't remember those two incidences. But it is interesting, because I can remember in between those two spaces of time where I'm on that sort of synthetic realm, I can remember prior to that being wheelbarrowed to my house. They'd put me in my bed. They hadn't covered me up. And I remember Choong calling this spook, and she said, "You could have at least covered her up." And she said, "What happened?" But this is when a lot of the lying came about, where they were saying I was just this party girl. You know, it was all happening because I was just loving, you know, I was instigating it as well, or just pretending that I didn't like it. So the timing of that for me is hard, because I can distinctly remember going onto that synthetic realm and having the near-death experience and waking up where I woke up. And I think I was off work for a couple of days, but I can also distinctly remember being wheelbarrowed. I can remember that Marine Sean seeing my eye twitch and saying, "What do we do with the body?" So for him, he was so psychopathic, so lacking in empathy. For him, it was a game anyway. So whether I lived, whether I died, he couldn't have cared less, you know. But I do remember that as part of me having that seizure, and just the shock, and then sort of going in and out of consciousness. So before I could actually see the agents. And down the track, when they were harassing me, my targeted harassment, which was for over 2 decades, one time they actually had a man and a woman dress up exactly as I'd seen them on that synthetic realm. And one of them later on came in by herself and dissolved, you know, and this is once I'd integrated. So they're all about trying to just muck you up, you know, really, really play with your mind, which I think even in
like
itself,
reinstigate this trauma as well, isn't it? It's like they're just trying to go back and just put you back into that trauma circuit, make you doubt.
And mind games, you know, they talk in a lot of half sentences, and they're always designed to make you think that they're in your head. And I was pretty traumatized when I first integrated, because I remember by then I was doing seeing people naturopathically, although that was interfered with. And when one came out, one of the Americans said, "Oh, as per usual, you're still giving a lot of detail, aren't you?" Now, when I remembered that, I remember thinking, how do you know what I wrote? How do you know? So, you know, when you've gone from having no memory, some of that, even of itself, was pretty shocking. Just knowing that, and Americans have, these American speaks had no respect for, you know, the sacredness of marriage or, you know, anything like that.
Or the
but anyway,
feminine.
after that second group assault, yeah, after that third one, well, in between that assault, the first one had come to light to Keith and Colin, and they called a meeting, but again, completely inappropriate. I never got counselling. I never got a medical exam. What if I harbored? What if I got pregnant? You know, none of that. And I remember that's when this US official came on board and started having meetings with me and the perpetrators, in which I would wake up at this building and be put back to sleep, just like the first time.
Oh,
and but nothing was ever really done. Like Keith, I remember him saying, "Well, look, we'll send you home." And I said, "Yeah, okay." Then the next day he came in and he said, "Look, do you really want to go home? I want that to be up to you." Well, because I had no memories of anything, and I was young and I had fire in my belly, and hey, I was, you know, on this posting, and it was, for me, it was also about building my resilience. I said, "Oh no, okay, I'll stay." Well, because I'd said that, that was when the cover up started really, really in full from Keith. And while I never got another offer, I never, you know, of help. Then it just kept going on. After a while, I stopped talking about it because I knew they didn't believe me anymore. When I said I'm being harassed by that man, Choong, I think they just, it was really awful actually, because sometimes he, you know, with all the fiddling that was going on and the drugging, I was in some very bad mental states anyway. And so getting back to that original sort of description of when my mind was really calm, I remember saying to that Marine, "Look, you're really affecting my mental health." But I had voice chatter in my head that was really, really loud. And when I think back on that, I think, oh my God, that was like the precursor to something really full on. And I remember just getting outside of my body and listening to it, and it dissipated. But I can see how some people, when they're fiddled with, could then get into, say, full-blown schizophrenia or even psychosis. I was so bad sometimes that I couldn't remember how to work the cabling system, you know, how to initiate the sequence.
Even to do your job, you're just struggling.
Even to do my job. And I remember Colin would come and go, "Oh," you know, like I was just an airhead. But I think along the way, sometimes, well, I know sometimes they were hypnotized to forget what was happening. So it was sort of a combination of factors there as to why I was not helped. So in terms of the time frame, it's hard, even sometimes remembering the sequencing, because sometimes you fiddle with to forget. You know, they're very good at sort of interfering with your time perspective as well. But all I know is it was 8 months, and then within that last month, I was fully subjugated by then to just be with that Marine until I left, until my replacement came. I remember at one point just giving up because it was so exhausting every day. You know, not just having to fob him off, not just being in shock all the time, not just being amnesiac, but I had nothing to hold on to. You know, I was just like this zombie. Yeah. So, and they could turn me up, turn me down, you know, but that was the really black group, I think, who were doing that tie into the first group at the beginning, who also tie into the later activities where I was getting into a car and going places, and, you know, who knows what I was doing.
Yeah, so 8 months of literally having no support, and as a young woman,
but also even though I knew that things weren't right, I also remember thinking, oh my God, you know, I haven't even fulfilled my posting. How is that going to look on my resume? Because I knew that my time with that department had been wrecked. But especially at that age, it seemed important. I remember thinking, if I can just hang out to a year, it won't look so bad. And I'll just keep staving him off, because again, in the back of my head was, he's got to get sick of this. Like, you know, generally with bullies, if they're not getting what they need, they get sick of it. But he never did.
Never did.
He seemed to feed on it. So I think definitely he was programmed. What entity behind that was harvesting, you know, that energy? But it seemed to give him a sense of energy. Like initially when he was there, I even wonder if he was a proper Marine, you know, because he didn't have that. Some of the blokes are really proud of themselves for the fact that they got there as a Marine, and they took a lot of pride in that. So these spooks are the lowest of the low. They didn't even care that they were ruining these men's sense of pride, that they were reducing them as well. you know, so
I grew
really
up
it was
with
all
all of
very
them.
driven.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was all very driven by black operatives. Some of the Marines weren't so nice, but I remember when I first got there, they were just very blokey and very into what they were doing. And, you know, it was only when this Marine, Choong, got there and started influencing them that it all became like this Mexican wave. And it just kept going on and on and on until the end where, as I said, I just got so tired, I just let him be with me. And that's when things seemed to calm down. I think by then, you know, enough memory blocking had been done and programming where these intelligence people said, right, okay, no other men from here on in,
Wow.
no other men.
It's
But
almost
in
like,
between that, I was having meetings. Sorry?
I was just going to say, it's like, this whole, scenario of just the repetitive trauma, him not, accepting, taking no for an answer, all
Yeah.
the electronics being used, it's like they just created such like a helplessness in you because you were stuck
Yeah.
there. You couldn't go anywhere. You're in a foreign country. Like every single person is ignoring this. Do you know what I mean? So it's just so awful that, on such a young woman who's over there alone, that it's like learned helplessness of just, I can't escape. Like I have to just accept this. And that's the worst of, ongoing trauma to a survivor as well.
Yeah. Well, the other thing was by then, ASIO had just sided with the US guys. And I think, I really do think they didn't know about the memory block or chose to just ignore what I was saying. I'll never understand that actually. I'll never understand how they could, since their job was to monitor security for employees and espionage was happening, how they could just ignore that. But they cut back my salary. Now, I was so traumatized in survival mode that, and nobody ever talked to me. Remembering, you know, I'm dealing with men who couldn't communicate anyway. No one ever sat down or gave me a right of reply, but none of them ever paid attention to the fact I was saying something is really wrong. You know, I'm not remembering stuff. Can you please at least send me home so I can get testing done and work out what's been done to me? So ASIO cut back my salary. So I had nowhere to go but my house. I had nowhere. So I used to stay back at work sometimes and I'd catch a taxi home much later. But even after a while, it didn't seem to matter what day of the night, what time of the night it was, that Marine was always there. Then in between that, when this bogus profile was being made and in between the harassments, this American spook said, now you're in a lot of trouble. And he actually came into the embassy and sat with Keith and said, and he didn't really say what they were doing other than I would be linked up to Sean. And he said, trust me, things will go easier on you if you just agree. And then he talked to Keith and Keith was sort of harumping like, okay, inconveniencing me again. And so then I signed this piece of paper. I guess it was a consent. But I mean, again, I was in no fit state to be agreeing to anything.
Yeah.
And so that was also when I had a neural link to that Marine, and he certainly seemed to be able to anticipate everything I thought, everything I did. I do recall him saying, just don't think your thoughts out loud. So that was when that chip went in. And I believe it wasn't just a neural link up. I believe it was behaviour modification as well, that either existed independently or complemented how I was neurally interfaced, where I could be phased in, phased out, turned up, turned down, And so, and that's, this is an ambassador simply because he didn't have a department behind him looking over his shoulder at how he was managing that posting, just allowing that to happen. And I know at least initially when I was being harassed and complaining more to him than Colin, other staff were more on my side at that time saying, why are you not doing anything? But he was very, very egocentric. And I remember him saying, well, what does this have to do with me? Like he didn't seem to think he had any responsibility or duty of care to keeping me safe. And as I said, it's an interesting culture, the rape culture, because the more it goes on, the more people are programmed to blame you because it's so unacceptable. So how do you make sense of all of this? I don't know how Keith reconciled that in his head. I do know he and Colin, as I said, were hypnotised on occasion to forget. And in fact, Colin's wife was hypnotised to forget how he behaved with me one time when he promised that he would help me come home and go home. And then he'd come over with the forms a couple of times and then ended up having intimacy with me. Now, the difference between him and me is that I was very, very traumatized and shut down. He was older than me. He should have known. I don't know, maybe the suggestion was given. I don't know, but I remember, you know, that happened, and then his wife was hypnotised. So was the Marine captain's wife. And I remember telling her at one point, saying, well, do you know what your husband's got up to? And then Speaks were so brazen. Right in front of me, they'd come and they'd do the Men in Black thing on her, and then she'd forget again. So it was a real, I used to call it Valley of the Dolls when I do my sing-song narrative. You know, say Valley of the Dolls, Valley of the Dolls, more like the Stepford Wives, memory block and microchip, Valley of the Dolls, you know. Some of it got quite crass, like with this Marine. You know, saying, I just need a hole. I just need a hole. Again, I don't think like this normally. A body to control in this Valley of the Dolls. But that helped cement that into my mind so that when I was being harassed, even though I had no visual memory, no emotional memory, I could come out with that sing-song narrative to let them know that I knew what was going on.
Wow.
Yeah.
Incredible that
So a lot of it, yeah, a lot of it becomes looping behaviour, and that's what upset me down the track is that when I first started, sort of like sometimes I'd get reactive, and I deliberately sort of get reactive in front of Colin or Keith because I think we have to consider me unacceptable. That'll have to be reported. They'll have to send me home. They never reported that. But it was a looping behaviour that became more pronounced in the later years, to a point where I had this thing at work, this cane wire thing that I threw at a US speak and threw it in. And I'm pretty sure that he died as a result of that. It was never just one branch of speaks. It seemed to be, again, a whole lot of different colour-coded ones. But what was interesting about that time was that a fellow in a black suit stood back watching, and he said, I think you've it's all right, you don't need to do that anymore. And I remember thinking, well, why wouldn't you step in? Again, why would you just enable that? So, you know, I know compartmentalization is one thing, but there are no good guys ever in Spook. So why were they allowing this one fellow? You know, how could they justify that?
So at that stage, you were sort of feeling that some of your, I guess, psychic capabilities were coming online, and you were retaliating against these people.
Yeah.
Is it right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were just observing.
And I know I was.
I mean,
Yeah,
they
were
the ones
observing.
they were the ones that more than likely activated those abilities in you and were watching. It's just such a sick culture, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I've talked to other survivors because I could do pretty trippy things that I can't explain. And well, I put some of that down to having spiritual armor. You know, one time they had a black helicopter. This is while I was still overseas, flying over, and I could literally move that with my mind. And one survivor I've spoken to, that's Adrian, said, you're actually moving the space behind that. Another time, my door was locked and I just had the lock replaced and I was given new keys, but I was so traumatized, I used the old keys and it opened the door. And I remember the owner who was just next door, again, everyone loving the drama because they were just, you know, obviously so starved for something to do, or, you know, that really sticks in my craw that, you know, they could have gone to higher thinking and studied, but no, they all had to feed into this drama and lower themselves in the process. So I could do that. Sometimes I could injure them with thought and I'd cough and imagine them choking, and sometimes they would actually choke, you know, stuff like that, that I think is a combination of my programming, possibly the drugs, possibly the interfacing, that I could definitely do that sort of stuff. And later on too, you know, which I think is what scared them. So it's, you know, it is true what survivors say, you know, and maybe that's why some of us are picked, but I tend to think we all have that potential to be more, including accessing our sort of, I guess, higher self or multidimensionality, but maybe it's amped up with that technology.
Absolutely. And they were using technology, for example, to connect all of the people there in that location in like a hive mind scenario too. So potentially that expanded, you know, what would be normally possible as well. So you went through 8 months of this horrific harassment, and then you finally got free, got home. And then
and by then I was completely dumbed down. Like I just said, oh, you know, I'm going home to study. It's time now.
And your harassment continued in Australia as well.
Yeah, but interestingly, by the time I got home, I couldn't even remember that Marine, Choong. Now, this has been months and months of harassment. I remember saying to my sister, the one who did sort of, I was closer to, oh, I think I must have had a boyfriend. and I could remember his name, but I couldn't, and as the years went by, I knew nothing about that. And in fact, I couldn't remember that posting, and I always knew that was odd. But I knew it went beyond normal trauma because I've always confronted stuff head on. I've always, I've never been afraid to be emotionally honest, and that's how we grow. And even if we've done something wrong, I had a bit of cognitive dissonance when I integrated, but you just have to suck it up and go, you know what, it's all good. Forgive yourself, and then hopefully in the practical point of understanding about other people's behaviour as well, that restores your capacity to care for other people. Because I know there for a while, when I was deep in my trauma, I just, I got very, very depressed, and I just stopped caring about anything and really anyone. And you never want to lose that connection to other people. And so that's where it's worthwhile being emotionally honest, and that's, I think, ultimately what helped me be able to further break through the memory barriers and decode and integrate stuff that was very, very painful.
That is a real strength of yours, Elizabeth, to be able to look at yourself emotionally and be honest about it, because that was allowing you to see and hold on to just these small enough parts overseas that you knew what was happening. And I think your journey since you've come home to Australia and started to reintegrate, it would have been so shocking to actually fathom that so many people were allowing a young woman to be in that horrific situation of being abused in so many ways, like physically, electronically, mentally, emotionally, even in the astral. Like that would have been so much for a young woman, with not loads of life experience yet, to just fathom, how evil the world is as well. So I think it's very courageous how you've, faced everything head on, done the research, done the self-work to really, hold space for yourself to allow that healing. And then be able to talk about these topics today that are still very much quite taboo, and just if they're not taboo in some fields, they're just completely not acknowledged as even being in existence. So I think you've done an incredible job with your reintegration as well.
Oh, thank you, Gabbi. It is complex because I had many cooks in the kitchen. There were these different levels, and that's what made it hard to all piece together. And but this is the thing, even when you've been, I think it's very cruel to amnesia people. I think the whole process, So obviously the MK Ultra, there's different offshoots. It never went away. It just went underground. But what turned me around, before we started this, was realizing that as I started to research, that's when I came across Fiona Barnett. Now, talk about courage. How courageous is she? And having to tolerate disbelief or be ridiculed, because again, we have all been amnesiac and socially engineered to be so dismissive of anything out of the ordinary. So, and hearing other stories, and particularly, for children who've had that targeting from birth, I thought, well, it's look at what they've had to go through, and that's what really turned me around, thinking that, oh my gosh, you wouldn't wish that on anyone. And then, just having a faith in something bigger. So all it did was make me really question that as well. And it did batter my faith as much as I was battered, by the experiences. All it's done is, maybe reinforce my faith in a divine creator source, and that we can heal. We absolutely can. I know that some of the people like Fiona don't advocate meditation because it's disassociation, but because I wasn't fragmented as such, like she was as a child, I personally found that very helpful. And I'm not ashamed to say I've had divine healing when I've needed it most. And keeping to a routine, I discovered sacred geometry. I'd always done my meditation, but that's been really, really awesome too. And just really appreciating what other people have gone through as well. Because, when you're in the thick of recall and integration, it's so hard to get out of your own head where you're just thinking, oh my God, because your whole life view is shattered. All I knew was there was a me beforehand. And yes, I knew things went right. I couldn't understand why I'd left my last course of study, which had been sabotaged during the harassment. I thought it was odd that I was still doing the same job when I was very, very driven and quite academic, and certainly back in the day. Why I had these triggers, why I was insecure, why I was quite neurotic at times about being a naturopath, where I'd worry about injuring people. So I knew things went right, why I was in this relationship where I felt like I wasn't growing and stretching and doing more. So, you know, the gift to all of it, if you're writing it out like I was, like I had no choice because, you know, I was stuck overseas. But as I said in my open letter to ASIO, that memory block ultimately saved my sanity. So I'm lucky in that, okay, they fiddled with me and they amnesiaed me, but I never lost the fundamental me, which always had a faith and a belief in something higher than myself. So I think it's really important that when people are reintegrating, as hurtful as it is, because, you know, you do, if you really do believe in God, you tend to feel betrayed. I know I did, where I thought this was demonic, this was black magic, this
How does
was,
this even happen?
yeah. And I've always lived my life, you know, giving to other people and being, you know, trying to be as kind, trying to be reflective on my behaviour. How can I be kinder? How can I be better to other people? So I just felt totally betrayed, to realizing that there are other people, and actually what would make me any better than someone else, much less a babe in arms who's still got the love light of God in their eyes to be saved. So therefore, this is part of these, you know, I believe, like our ascension process. And I know that there's end of times programming, so I don't put any particular ideology on it. It's just a word, but I do believe that as we let that light in through healing and keeping our capacity to care for other people, that we connect more to those high sort of divine realms.
Absolutely.
You know, it really is literally shining darkness into these areas. And I'd like to think, you know, obviously it's cycles within cycles, but we're helping to break that by the more light we shed, you know, on these areas. And that's where we all need to have a voice. We all need to be supportive of each other. Like I said to you, I was a bit reticent for a long time because I thought, I don't want anyone. What if someone's really mean to me about this? What if I get trolled? Like, it's been hard enough having to sort of integrate. But I think in this community, particularly with the people that you have, people are more keen to be supportive, but also to learn from it.
Yeah.
And they're really, really appreciative of being given this sort of information.
Definitely. We're all learning from each other.
Yep, and breaking the taboos, you know, and I really credit, you know, Fiona Barnett with paving the way. She really was a, you know, a trailblazer for getting more people heard because, you know, I look at some of my extended family who they've been raised not really knowing any of this. And it's hard because I have this family where I can't really talk about it because in my own immediate with siblings, we've all been actively discouraged really to talk as adults. And when I was trying to explain what had happened even to my own mum, you know, again, that generation cut-off point, no, that didn't happen. Even when I said to her, look, I've got the email, I've got proof this Marine was dishonourably discharged, and how often does that happen? So what, she said, because she couldn't process it, didn't want to know, you know.
It's not, it doesn't connect to anything they're consciously aware of. So let's just throw it out, you know, that cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, and just, you know, so when you've had a dynamic in a family that's fairly fixed, and particularly when it's been dysfunctional and that dynamic's fixed, I thought, you know, there's nothing I can do about that, but I know my truth and I'll just keep going in exposing it as best I can. But I look at my extended family and I think, well, you started off, you know, we all start off as kids and then grow up as adults, but if they're not in the know, if they're not apprised, how are they forewarned? Because if that could happen to me, and I'm pretty sure this started when I was little, the initial interfacing, because I have memories of when I was 4 or 5 getting into a car with military men in dark suits. And I can remember talking to them about how I saw ascension. I said, when I'm 55, you know, this earth will be a sun. And I mean, I never paid much attention when I look back on those memories because I was a very creative kid. You know, my friend across the road was called Astro. We were from the stars. You know, we don't know what we're picking up from on the collective unconscious. But I can remember at one point I lost my vision in the car with them and I said, oh, gee, it's dark, you know. And then later on when I was being harassed, I would physically lose my vision. that was done through interface. And again, because there were these different levels of people doing different stuff, and none of them in the know as to what each group were, it's almost like they were showing off, saying, ha, 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 you know, we can block her vision. Guess who we are, sort of thing. And I have sort of heard, you know, clairaudiently, the word that always comes to me is game. So at some level, it's a game to them anyway. You know,
certainly seems like it's a game, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't that so interesting that it seems like you were almost, I don't know if I'd say targeted, or they found, you know, you potentially for being very open to, you know, these energetic realms as a child, or more open, and the military kind of spotted you out as such. And then, you know, does that mean that, you know, your future path, you know, to go through and work in a place like Mexico as a diplomat was somewhat handled and set up as well? It's so interesting.
But it's interesting, Gabby. I think so too. Like, I think a lot of people, as I said, the interface, they don't know it, they're activated later when they serve a purpose. I always feel like there was a higher divine mission with me, because I remember when I got that job, I worked for Treasury, and I remember driving across, and anyway, this woman opposite me, she lost control of her car. She was coming straight for me, and I could feel my car move out of my hands, and all of a sudden my car's facing this opposite way to this other car, and she drives past me, and the look on her face. Now, divine intervention wasn't my higher self actually moving that car, I don't know.
Yeah.
But, you know, the fact that I wasn't assisted angelically validates it more, because we're all here, we're all spiritual brothers and sisters. Yeah. We're all in it together, right? But I do think, well, you know, maybe at that higher realm, I knew what was to be, because why would that car be moved? You know, otherwise she would have crashed into me, I would have had time off, I would not have taken that job, and it wouldn't have been on that timeline that it was, you know, when I had that posting, and then what happened. So,
and then I think, you know, there's so many experiences that we've all, you know, lived through. They perhaps weren't ones that we believe we would have chosen, but they have now put us in a position where we can expose the truth. And, you know, that brings a lot of meaning and purpose to healing through what we've experienced, you know, to know that we can make a difference, that we can be here to support other people that may be just waking up or just starting to remember what they have actually experienced in their own lives. And yeah, like you said, like being in that service to others, you know, brings this beautiful sense of gratitude and purpose and mission to our lives. And, you know, it'll never take away that trauma that should never have happened, you know, in this inverted plane. But I think it's a beautiful way that we can actually expand, you know, as individuals, and, you know, honor our own journeys, honor, you know, the things that we've lived through, and create purpose out of them, as well as healing collectively. And you're a beautiful example of that, Elizabeth, you know, to heal through so much, you know, and know from, you know, your early 20s that, you know, there's these horrific Black projects that are being used against, you know, everyday people, you know, a young woman, and to heal through that, and, you know, now be in the position to speak out and help people through your work as a naturopath, etc. You know, I think that's a beautiful journey. Like, it's a beautiful completion of the work that you've done as well.
Thank you, Gabbi. When I've been lucky, it's interesting, you know, one way or another, I say we survivors, we find each other. So I met this Reiki practitioner, the one that helped me when I was psychically attacked that night. She was the one whose husband was the sniper, you know, Black Ops sniper, who got memory blocked, who had the chip put in that's never been taken out. She managed to take one out. So had it not been for her when I first sort of got my memories back, I don't know where I'd be. So it's all, you know, where would we be without each other? And she said, you know, you're such a support for me, because she said I had no one to talk to about this sort of stuff. So her husband had shown her very exotic weaponry, and she said, I know it wasn't from here. So as you say, where does it come from? Some people say that Area 52 is a psyops. All I know is it's exotic. It's obviously been reverse engineered. I would say in some instances, depending on really high level energy workers like Solaris, for example, that they have been the technology. But by keeping our hearts open and minimizing that negative ego. So where ego is a problem is where, and this was a problem with the Marine, is when people have low self-esteem, but an ego, a big ego. That's a very poor fit. You know, we earn our self-esteem, and we earn it through sometimes also being emotionally honest and going, you know what, I'm not happy I behave like that. But obviously in acknowledging that and knowing you can do better is what lifts us up and gets us more emotionally intelligent.
It gets us out of the
It's,
denial and being a victim. It's like, I
but
want more.
yeah, it's our best armor against this technology, because I can remember sometimes in the streets, people would be hypnotized, right? The whole street. This is how arrogant they are. And I wouldn't be. So obviously the more emotionally open we are and connected to, you know, creator source, however that is for people, that does become our armor. Now I was a bit sort of upset. I only, you know, managed to integrate because this speaker decoded me, and then I did poetry and prose, and all of a sudden I broke through this barrier and was also attacked, but that's another story, which was very, very scary. But you know, what upset me was, would I have ever been able to integrate, you know, had he not decoded me? Well, the more I think about the heart as being a portal to everything, I think probably it's possible we can. And maybe that's why in my 30s I had, you know, when they say programming breaks down, I had more that week long, you know, series of that man coming in and violating me. It was to keep the programming in place. Yeah. So that's the thing, not feeding into fear, knowing that, you know, it's that loving neutrality or samadhi state that I love, which is, it is what it is until it isn't. It takes the emotional sting out. It takes the intensity out. And it's a one way of keeping that heart open so that we can heal, but also, you know, protect ourselves against that technology. Because if that could happen to me as a homegrown young person, obviously it's happening to a lot of people. Logic dictates, right?
Absolutely, it is. And we know, I mean, I speak to countless survivors and whistleblowers that this is happening to all varying degrees. Like what you experienced is, you know, quite extreme in some ways because you were isolated and you were overseas, and it was happening in a workplace.
Yeah.
Whereas most survivors, it's, you know, harassment, it's targeting. But yeah, I thought it's really beautiful what you mentioned before about, you know, by keeping our hearts open, it gives us that possibility of healing. And it sounds so simple, but if you look at, you know, working back and sort of reverse engineering from what they're doing, every single part of this technology, black magic, control, even the brainwashing that society's under, it's all linked to trauma. So if we can actually, you know, look at what we're able to be in control of, you know, we're in control of being able to release trauma from our bodies, release trauma from our emotions, release it from our energy fields and our minds, and we can take, you know, charge of that. And like, I know for my journey, when I was under severe attack for 2 years, it was only through, you know, that was the one thing I could do, was release my own trauma, because I knew it just wouldn't stop. But as I released all my traumas and found them, because this technology was hitting them, it became less and less able to affect me. And I don't think it ever will completely go away. And I'm sure that you still, you know, are targeted occasionally as well, Elizabeth, but it puts you in a position of power. So like, it's just like, oh, seriously, like, sod off, do you know what I mean? Like, because I know that I can quite easily rise above it. And if anything was to happen, I'm kind of like, oh, you know, what's changed in my life? Do I need to rest more? Have I not been eating well? Like, you know, who have I potentially engaged energetically or pissed off, so to speak? And so you sort of, you've moved out of that learned helplessness of, I can't escape this, it's going to happen to me every day, this is the rest of my life. So now it's just like, no, it's not happening. You know, you acknowledge it and just work on, you know, what you can do to heal yourself. So
I think not over identifying with it either, because if you haven't healed, you can leap back into it. Our minds are powerful co-creators. So I know I had hypnotic encoding in my brain, or once I was decoded, I would have remembered straight away. But I had to go through a process of removing that final encoding through poetry that again accesses that different part of the brain, which connects to the rhyming narrative I had. But so if people are feeding into that, you know, they may very well be triggering hypnotic codes that can make them manifest what they can manifest, because, you know, we can all create what we believe we can create. So I'd say, I know, again, it's easy to say, but you don't over identify. And I think a lot of the time why it didn't really affect me, because they were, you know, trying out psychotronic stuff where I'd feel like tingles on my head. Some days I'd be made to feel pain superimposed on my body, but I always knew the difference. You know, even though I was made ultimately into this sort of robot, I could tell initially someone was fiddling in my head, and it was only because through repeated trauma that they were able to, carry that off. Failing that, yeah, I've had a few zaps. You know, I'm here where I've woken up with, fullness and ringing and that sort of thing. But I just think, sticks and stones, I'm on a spiritual path. Keep doing it, because I've already died more than once at your hands. I really don't feel any fear about that. But what I do think is we are part of an equation. We are part of this spiritual matrix. So the more they do it, the more that equation has got to balance out to the side of good, because they're going against natural laws. This technology, the way it is used, is an abomination. And really, people, if they were evolved enough in their own spiritual processes, telepathy wouldn't be such a big deal. Psychism wouldn't be a big deal. But a lot of that has been, sanitized out of our culture, where even just to be spiritual is, it's not really the norm for anyone even to say have a religion. So I just think the more they do it, I think, yeah, well, you know what, you're writing your own extinction or really, really bad karma if you do get to sort of come back to this world in that reincarnational sort of trap, or however that works out for that person. So yeah, I just I think it's, you know what, I've also had a separation experience that was angelic, that showed me that I had a higher heart center. And honestly, when I was there, nothing mattered. I thought, this is the small stuff. This is, I
Yeah.
guess, just a man-made world. So I think even if it happened now, there would be very few effects on me. I would be able to sort of transmute that pain, and that's what it's all about. Coming from the heart, coming from that place of emotional honesty, you're either helped spiritually, but it's also reigniting that faith that we have a higher self that knows what it's doing, and ultimately we're part of that God source, and that will never change. But we can become empowered and enlightened and healed in the process.
So beautiful. And that's the biggest thing to remember is, there's hope, and that we are actually so much stronger than all of this nonsense. It's just the smoke and mirrors of mind control, that we're being very much tricked, that we can't rise above this. And yeah, it's so very possible to do that. So thank you so much for sharing, Elizabeth. And I know, your story gives me so much hope for, for all of us, being able to, rise above the technology and the things that they're using against us, but just for the healing of our collective, and for this beautiful space that's being held by more and more people to understand, to learn from each other, and to comprehend. So is there anything that you would like to add before we finish up?
No, I just thank you for having me. And as I said, it's complex because it's different levels involved, but I just hope that my story helps other people know that they're not alone.
I think that's been, the gem out of the last years, as things have just gotten so heated and challenged, is these challenges have actually meant that we spread out, we find each other, and it's like we've really found our soul groups now to work with, to create what we're here to do. So thank you so much for sharing, and I know that everyone will get a lot out of what you've had to endure, and the way that you've risen above it. I just think you're such an incredible example of what's possible with healing, and most of all, that so much of that healing is very much within us. Like if we tune into ourselves, empower ourselves,
Absolutely.
we don't need to
Absolutely.
third parties. And as whistleblowers and survivors, you can do it on your own. And I think that's beautiful, but it's also safe, and you're not really doing it on your own anymore, because there's all of us together speaking out too.